I stood frozen in my driveway as flames engulfed my Ford sedan, while the HOA president watched with crossed arms, smirking. "Next time, you'll think twice about refusing to join," she sneered, not realizing she had just committed arson against a man who'd spent 15 years putting criminals behind bars. What happens when neighborhood tyrants pick the absolute worst person to terrorize? After 23 years prosecuting organized crime in Chicago, I was ready for peace and quiet. Oak Estates seemed perfect. Manicured lawns, pristine houses, and the promise of suburban tranquility. Moving day went smoothly. A few neighbors even brought welcome baskets. That's when I first noticed her watching from across the street. Sandra Whitmore, clipboard in hand, studying my moving boxes like they contained evidence. The doorbell rang at 7 a.m. the next morning. There stood Sandra, pearl necklace gleaming against her crisp blazer. "Welcome to Oak D," she said with a smile that never reached her eyes. "I'm the president of our homeowners association. I brought your membership papers." I reviewed the documents. 47 pages of restrictions, regulations, and monthly dues that seemed astronomical for what they provided. "I appreciate the offer," I said, "but I'll pass." Her smile vanished. "Everyone joins the HOA, Mr. Carter. It's practically mandatory." "Practically isn't the same as legally required," I replied, handing back the papers. Something darkened behind her eyes. "You don't understand. The HOA protects everyone's interest here." "I'm sure it does," I said, "but I'll manage my property my own way, thank you." Her practiced composure cracked slightly. "That's unfortunate. Residents who don't participate often find Okie less accommodating." The threat wasn't subtle. I'd heard similar tones from mob enforcers. "Is that a warning, Miss Whitmore?" "Simply an observation. Everyone joins eventually," she said. She turned to leave, then paused. "Oh, in your mailbox. It's 3 inches taller than regulations permit. You'll want to fix that." My mailbox was identical to others on the street. This wasn't about compliance. It was about control. That night, I found the first note on my windshield: "Conform or leave." The next morning, neighbors who'd welcomed me suddenly avoided eye contact. I'd spent my career recognizing patterns of intimidation. The tactics were familiar, just with a suburban veneer. What Sandra didn't realize yet was that she wasn't dealing with an ordinary homeowner. She was using a crime family's playbook against someone who'd written the manual on taking them down. 3 weeks into my standoff with the HOA, the psychological warfare intensified. Each day brought new concerns, neighbors at my door with rehearsed speeches about community standards and property values. One afternoon, Bill Henderson from 2 doors down appeared on my porch. "Look, I'm just trying to help," he said, glancing nervously over his shoulder. "Before you, there were the Thompsons. They didn't join either. Their kids' bikes kept getting vandalized. Then their dog mysteriously got sick. They moved within 3 months." I recognized the technique, fear wrapped in neighborly concern. Instead of showing anger, I invited him in for coffee. "You seem worried, Bill," I said, activating the recording app on my phone discreetly. "How long have you lived in Oakland?" 7 years, he replied, fidgeting with his coffee mug. "Sandra runs a tight ship. Things work smoothly when everyone follows the rules." I nodded sympathetically. "And what happens when they don't?" His eyes darted to the window. "Problems happen. Car trouble, permit issues, social isolation." "Sounds organized," I said, "almost like a system." "Look," he lowered his voice, "Sandra has connections at City Hall. She can make life difficult. Just last year, the Millers questioned assessment fees. Next thing, they had building inspectors finding code violations that never existed before. And everyone just accepts this? What choice is there?" He sighed. "Sandra keeps files on everyone. She knows which buttons to push." I leaned forward. "How many other families has she pushed out, Bill?" "At least 6 that I know of," he said. His admission hung in the air. "Oh God, I shouldn't have said that." "Actually, Bill," I said, revealing my phone, "I think you said exactly what needed to be said." His face drained of color. "She'll know I talked." "No, she won't," I assured him, "because you're now protected by something more powerful than Sandra. Evidence in a federal investigation." His eyes widened. "Federal? Who are you?" I smiled. "Just a new neighbor who knows exactly how to handle organized intimidation." As Bill left, visibly shaken, I felt a familiar satisfaction. The first piece of evidence was secure. The HOA didn't realize they weren't terrorizing a helpless homeowner. They were providing case materials against themselves. The discovery that Sandra had systematically forced out 6 families gave him a shim. I leaned forward. How many other families has she pushed out, Bill? At least 6 that I know of, he said. His admission hung in the air. Oh God, I shouldn't have said that. Actually, Bill, I said, revealing my phone, I think you said exactly what needed to be said. His face drained of color. She'll know I talked. No, she won't, I assured him, because you're now protected by something more powerful than Sandra, evidence in a federal investigation. His eyes widened. Federal, who are you? I smiled. Just a new neighbor who knows exactly how to handle organized intimidation. As Bill left, visibly shaken, I felt a familiar satisfaction. The first piece of evidence was secure. The HOA didn't realize they weren't terrorizing a helpless homeowner. They were providing case materials against themselves. The discovery that Sandra had systematically forced out 6 families gave me a clear direction. This wasn't just petty neighborhood tyranny. It had all the markers of a racketeering operation. I decided to apply the same methodical approach I'd used against crime syndicates. My first step was surveillance. I installed cameras covering my property, visible ones as a deterrent, hidden ones to gather evidence. It paid off immediately. At 3:17 a.m., my phone alerted me to movement in the front yard. On the screen, there was Sandra, business suit exchanged for black clothing, measuring my grass with a ruler and photographing my mailbox. Rather than confronting her, I documented the trespass and began building my case file. Next came counterintelligence. Each morning, I walked the neighborhood before dawn, photographing similar violations at board members' homes. Jim Baker's fence that exceeded height restrictions, Treasurer Helen Porter's unapproved garden gnomes, Sandra's own non-regulation porch lights. The hypocrisy was blatant and now documented. I leveraged my federal contacts quietly. My former colleague at the FBI ran background checks that revealed Sandra's sealed embezzlement conviction from her previous homeowners association in Florida. Helen had an insurance fraud case settled out of court. 3 other board members had financial irregularities in their histories. This wasn't random. Sandra had assembled a team with specific skills and vulnerabilities she could control. The pattern became clear when I followed the HOA's maintenance worker to a storage unit rented under Sandra's maiden name. While he was inside, I placed a small tracking device on his vehicle, a technique I'd used countless times on syndicate couriers. The next day, I arrived at the storage facility with a warrant obtained through a judge who owed me a favor. Inside were meticulously organized files on every resident who'd ever questioned Sandra's authority, financial information, personal photographs, and detailed pressure strategies tailored to each family's vulnerabilities. Most disturbing was a section labeled Elimination Successes, containing documentation of the 6 families who'd been forced out, including recordings of their distress and photos of their moving trucks that could only have been taken by someone celebrating their departure. The operation was sophisticated. HOA dues weren't just padding Sandra's lifestyle. They funded a network of contractors, city officials, and even 2 local police officers who'd respond to nuisance calls against targeted residents. Bank records showed thousands funneled through shell companies for neighborhood improvements that never materialized. Each discovery connected to another. Sandra hadn't just created a corrupt HOA, she'd established a perfect microcosm of organized crime, and I was ready to dismantle it piece by piece. The familiar rush of building a case returned. Each piece of evidence strengthened the web that would eventually trap her. The turning point came when I intercepted communications between board members discussing their special assessment fund, a slush fund used to pay their enforcement network. In one email, Sandra explicitly instructed Jim to arrange for my water service to be disrupted as a first-level warning. I recognized the pattern immediately. It was identical to how crime families escalated pressure on businesses that wouldn't pay protection money. Start with inconveniences, escalate to property damage, and finally move to violence. Sandra was following the same playbook, but against someone who had spent decades learning to dismantle it. Sandra's campaign against me entered a new phase with precision that would have impressed even the most ruthless crime bosses I prosecuted. My water mysteriously shut off mid-shower. My mail arrived mangled or went missing entirely. 3 times I found dead birds arranged on my welcome mat, Amateur intimidation, but effective in its message. The social isolation cut deeper than the practical inconveniences. Neighbors crossed the street to avoid me. Children were hurried away when I walked past. Invitations to community events stopped arriving. I'd experienced similar tactics from mob families who turned neighborhoods against witnesses, but experiencing it firsthand revealed the true psychological toll. The HOA's monthly newsletter, printed on expensive glossy paper that surely consumed a significant portion of those inflated dues, began featuring a community concerns column. It described an unnamed resident whose refusal to participate endangers our community standards. The article detailed suspicious activity at my address and hinted at potential criminal connections. The irony wasn't lost on me. One morning I found my garbage cans overturned, contents scattered across my lawn, just as Sandra drove by with the code enforcement officer she kept in her pocket. The $250 citation arrived that afternoon. When I contested it with clear evidence of tampering, the appeal was denied without review. Classic racketeering: create the problem, then profit from the solution. Their mistake was assuming I was fighting alone. 20 years prosecuting organized crime had taught me to build networks of my own. I maintained contact with Bill Henderson through secure channels, gathering intelligence about upcoming HOA maneuvers. I documented every violation, building a case that grew stronger each day. The true turning point came when I discovered Alice Greenberg crying on her porch. At 83, Alice had lived in Oak longer than anyone. She clutched an HOA violation notice citing her unauthorized wind chimes and excessive bird feeders. The fine was $750, almost her entire monthly Social Security check. "They've never bothered me before," she sobbed, "but yesterday, I waved to you when you walked past." This morning, this was taped to my door. The vindictiveness infuriated me. "Alice, has Sandra pressured you before?" "Not until you moved in. Now she says I need to show community solidarity by avoiding disruptive elements." Alice wiped her eyes. "I've lived here 37 years. My Herald helped build the park they're so proud of." I made a decision. "Alice, what if I told you we could stop Sandra permanently, but I need your help?" Her expression shifted from despair to determination. "That woman has bullied her last neighbor. What do you need?" I showed Alice my evidence file, the surveillance photos, financial records, and pattern of harassment. Her eyes widened. "She's been doing this for years. The Johnsons, the Patels, the Wilsons, all wonderful families who suddenly moved. I always wondered why." Alice became my most valuable ally. Her home, assumed to be safe by Sandra's crew, became our operational headquarters. Other neighbors carefully joined our resistance. The Mendez family, whose landscaping business lost contracts after they questioned assessment increases. Tom Franklin, whose disability accommodation requests were repeatedly denied. The Chongs, who faced constant citations after refusing to remove their cultural garden ornaments. We created a shadow network within OKD, documenting abuses and building a comprehensive case. Small recording devices captured board members making threats. Hidden cameras recorded their enforcers vandalizing property. Most critically, we tracked the money, following every dollar from inflated dues to Sandra's network of corrupt officials. Sandra sensed the resistance forming, but couldn't identify its source. Her tactics grew more desperate and more careless. As pressure increased, so did her mistakes. She didn't realize she wasn't fighting just one stubborn homeowner anymore. She was facing a coordinated operation led by someone who had dismantled organizations far more sophisticated than her suburban crime ring. The quarterly HOA meeting was mandatory for all residents, another of Sandra's control mechanisms. The community center buzzed with tension as I took a seat in the back row. Alice nodded discreetly from across the room. Our hidden recording devices activated. Sandra dominated the meeting with practiced authority, detailing new security measures that conveniently required a special assessment of $500 per household. When the financial report showed a $43,000 surplus, Sandra quickly glossed over it. My moment had arrived. "I'd like to ask about line item 6 on page 3, I said, standing. The room fell silent. "It shows $43,000 for administrative consulting, but there's no breakdown of these services." Sandra's smile tightened. "Those are standard operational expenses, Mr. Carter. If you joined the HOA, you'd receive the detailed reports. Actually, public disclosure laws require financial transparency regardless of membership, I countered, distributing copies of the relevant statute, especially concerning funds collected under color of authority. Whispers rippled through the crowd. Sandra's face flushed. Are you accusing the board of something, Mr. Carter? I'm simply requesting information all homeowners are legally entitled to, unless there's something in those expenses you'd prefer to keep hidden. Her composure cracked. Some people seem determined to undermine the stability of our community, she hissed. People who refuse to contribute yet demand privileges. People who clearly don't understand that some personal tragedies are entirely preventable. The threat hung in the air as she glared directly at me. This meeting is adjourned, she snapped, gathering her papers while instructing board members to stay behind. At 3:07 a.m., the sound of breaking glass jolted me awake. From my bedroom window, I watched a figure approach my car in the driveway. Security lights illuminated Sandra's face as she poured liquid over the hood. The acrid smell of gasoline drifted through my open window. I activated the emergency recording protocol on all cameras and dialed 911. As Sandra struck a match, the whoosh of flames was immediate, hungry fire engulfing my sedan. I reported the arson in progress, specifically identifying Sandra Whitmore as the perpetrator. Most revealing was Sandra's reaction. She didn't flee. Instead, she stepped back, crossed her arms, and watched the blaze with satisfaction. When neighbors emerged from their homes in panic, she calmly stated, "This is what happens to people who don't understand community standards." Her eyes met mine through the window. Rather than showing fear of being caught, she smiled, confident in her impunity, certain that her suburban facade would shield her from the consequences of her organized crime. Her network of corrupt officials would protect her, as it always had. The fire department arrived quickly, followed by 2 police officers I recognized from Sandra's payroll documentation. When I attempted to show them the surveillance footage, they insisted it needed to be processed through proper channels. I played the traumatized victim perfectly, appearing shocked and confused. Sandra provided a practiced alibi about being home asleep, while the officers nodded sympathetically. As they left, Sandra lingered behind, approaching me with a whisper. Next time, it might not be just your car. Some accidents happen inside homes. She had no idea she just delivered the final piece of evidence I needed, on camera, with multiple witnesses, and to a federal prosecutor who just watched her commit felony arson. As dawn broke over the charred remains of my car, I made a crucial strategic decision. Rather than immediately revealing my profession, I maintained the facade of a frightened homeowner. The officers, clearly in Sandra's pocket, filed a report listing the cause as an electrical malfunction, despite the overwhelming smell of gasoline still hanging in the air. "These things happen," one officer said with practiced indifference. "Maybe consider joining the HOA. They have excellent security protocols." I nodded meekly, playing my role. "I'll think about it." The moment they left, I activated the next phase of my operation. The surveillance footage, already secured on encrypted servers, was transmitted to Jessica Ramirez, my former deputy at the Chicago field office. Within an hour, she called back. "Holy hell, Mark," she exclaimed. "This is textbook racketeering with bonus arson. We've got jurisdiction the second she used fire." "I need this done by the book," I instructed. "This woman has half the local authorities compromised. Federal warrants, full tactical team, simultaneous execution." By noon, Judge Martinez, who still remembered how I protected his family during a cartel trial, had signed search warrants for 7 addresses, the homes of all board members, the HOA office, and Sandra's storage unit. At precisely 6 a.m. the next morning, synchronized raids hit all 7 locations. I deliberately stayed away, maintaining my cover, while the FBI's tactical teams executed flawlessly. Sandra was still in her bathrobe when agents breached her front door, her expression of entitlement collapsing as they presented federal warrants. The evidence recovered exceeded even my expectations. Sandra's home office contained financial records detailing embezzlement from 3 different homeowners associations. Helen Porter's computer held spreadsheets tracking compliance incentives, bribes to local officials. Jim Baker maintained detailed surveillance logs on problematic residents. Most damning was the discovery in Sandra's garage: gasoline-soaked clothing matching what she'd worn during the arson, hidden behind holiday decorations. The arrogance was staggering. She hadn't even bothered to dispose of the evidence. The storage unit yielded the operational manual of their enterprise, a binder Sandra titled Community Management Techniques that outlined escalating pressure tactics, from social isolation to property damage. It included profiles of every resident who'd ever opposed her, complete with their vulnerabilities and pressure points. I waited until all evidence was secured before making my entrance. As FBI agents escorted Sandra from her home in handcuffs, I stepped from my unmarked federal vehicle, badge visible on my belt. Federal Prosecutor Mark Carter, I introduced myself formally. Organized Crime Division. The shock on Sandra's face was everything I'd hoped for. The dawning horror as she realized she'd targeted not just any homeowner, but someone with the exact expertise to dismantle her operation. "This is absurd," she sputtered. "I'm the victim here. This man refused to comply with community standards." Community standards don't typically include arson, extortion, mail fraud, and racketeering, I replied calmly. But we've documented at least 37 federal violations so far. Her composure completely shattered. "Do you know who I am? I have connections. This neighborhood needs me." "What this neighborhood needs is justice," I said, loud enough for gathering neighbors to hear. "And as someone who spent 20 years prosecuting organized crime, I can assure you, your organization was amateur at best." As FBI agents led her away, neighbors emerged from their homes, watching in stunned silence. Alice approached, tears streaming down her face. "Is it really over?" "It's over," I confirmed, "and something better can begin." The look of relief spreading across faces that had lived in fear for years was more satisfying than any courtroom victory I'd ever experienced. Federal courtrooms have a way of diminishing even the most imposing figures. Sandra Whitmore, stripped of her designer clothes and forced into standard-issue attire, looked smaller than I remembered. The 7 defendants sat in a row, the entire HOA board, now united in mutual suspicion rather than community control. The prosecution was handled by Jessica Ramirez, allowing me to sit as a witness rather than prosecutor. She began methodically establishing the pattern of racketeering that had terrorized Oak Estates for years. "The United States will prove that these defendants operated a criminal enterprise disguised as a homeowners association," she declared. "They used intimidation, fraud, and violence to extort money and compliance from their neighbors." The evidence was overwhelming. Financial audits revealed over $1.2 million in misappropriated funds across 5 years. Forensic accountants traced money flowing from HOA accounts to offshore shells and back to the defendants' personal finances. But the courtroom fell completely silent when the surveillance video played. Sandra deliberately pouring gasoline on my car, lighting the match, then crossing her arms to watch it burn with satisfaction. Her attorney's claims about community protection collapsed as the jury watched her clear delight in the destruction. Former residents who'd been driven out returned to testify. The Patels described threatening notes with racial slurs. The Wilsons recounted how their children were systematically excluded from community events. The Johnsons explained how their business mysteriously lost clients after they questioned assessment increases. Sandra's defense strategy imploded when her co-defendants began turning against each other. Treasurer Helen Porter was the first to break, offering testimony for leniency. Sandra called it applying appropriate pressure, she testified. She kept what she called an elimination list of residents who questioned her authority. The goal was always to force them out and replace them with compliant neighbors. The bombshell came when Helen revealed Sandra's special notebook, a meticulous record of successful removals, with photographs of moving trucks and calculations of the profits generated when properties were sold under duress. Sandra's attorney attempted a desperate defense. "My client was simply enforcing community standards that everyone agreed to." "Did everyone agree to arson, Miss Whitmore?" Jessica countered. "Did they agree to harassment, intimidation, and fraud?" When I took the stand, Sandra couldn't maintain eye contact. I methodically outlined how her operation mirrored organized crime tactics I'd prosecuted for decades. The same patterns of territory control, intimidation, and financial exploitation. "In 23 years," I began, "I've seen sophisticated syndicates fall to these exact methods. Sandra's HOA was no different. just smaller and sloppier. The jury didn't need long to deliberate. The verdict was unanimous. Guilty on all counts. Prosecuting criminal enterprises, I concluded, I've never seen one hide so effectively behind respectability while terrorizing an entire community. Judge Eleanor Maxwell, herself a former victim of HOA overreach, delivered the verdict with unmistakable satisfaction. The court finds all defendants guilty on all counts, she declared. Her sentencing speech became infamous in legal circles. You corrupted the very concept of community, she told Sandra. You weaponized neighbors against each other for personal profit. You didn't just violate federal law, you violated the trust and safety of those who simply wanted a peaceful place to live. Sandra received 15 years for racketeering, with additional consecutive sentences for arson, mail fraud, and obstruction of justice. The other board members received sentences ranging from 5 to 12 years. The most powerful moment came when Sandra was led away in handcuffs, finally understanding that her reign of suburban terror had ended. As she passed me, she whispered, "I should have checked who you were before burning your car." "Yes," I replied quietly, "you really should have." The courtroom erupted in applause as the defendants disappeared through the door leading to the federal detention center, a community finally united in relief rather than fear. The first neighborhood meeting after Sandra's conviction was held on my front lawn. No formal invitations, no mandatory attendance, no threats, just neighbors gathering by choice for the first time in years. "I don't even know half of you," Alice observed, looking around at the faces. "Sandra kept us so isolated from each other." That simple observation became our starting point. We introduced ourselves properly, not as addresses or assessment values, but as people with names, stories, and shared hopes for our community. The transformation was immediate and profound. The Mendez family volunteered their landscaping skills to help elderly residents maintain their yards. The Changs taught traditional cooking classes in their now unrestricted cultural garden. Children played freely between houses without fear of violation notices. We dismantled the HOA structure entirely, replacing it with a simple, voluntary community covenant based on mutual respect rather than control. The intimidating rulebook, 73 pages of restrictions under Sandra's regime, was ceremoniously recycled and replaced with a single page of reasonable guidelines. The most symbolic change came when we removed the pretentious Oak Ridge Estates monument sign, Sandra's prideful marker of exclusive territory, and replaced it with a community garden where neighbors could grow food together. We planted the first seedlings exactly where Sandra used to stand to survey her domain. Recovery wasn't instant. Years of enforced suspicion had created deep wounds. Some residents still flinched when neighbors approached their property. Others hesitated before making even minor changes to their homes, the ingrained fear of retribution lingering like a ghost. Healing came through practical action. We established a restitution program using seized HOA assets, returning thousands in fraudulent fines to affected residents. Most satisfying was helping Mrs. Gonzalez recover her home. She'd been forced to sell under duress when Sandra targeted her for displaying a cultural flag. Former enemies became allies in rebuilding trust. Tom Franklin, who'd once reported neighbors under Sandra's orders, now coordinated a neighborhood watch program based on mutual protection rather than surveillance. Helen Porter, following her reduced sentence, sent a handwritten apology to every household. The most profound transformation was invisible, the disappearance of fear. Neighbors who'd lived defensively for years gradually lowered their guards. Conversations happened spontaneously across property lines. Children formed friendships based on proximity rather than parental alliances. 1 year after Sandra's conviction, we held our first official neighborhood celebration. Looking around at laughing families sharing food across picnic tables, where unauthorized gatherings had once been punished, I realized we hadn't just removed a criminal enterprise. We'd rediscovered what community actually meant. Alice summed it up perfectly. For years, we lived next to each other. Now we finally live with each other. What happened in Oak Estates didn't stay in Oak Estates. As news of Sandra's conviction spread, my office received calls from homeowners across the country describing identical patterns of intimidation and corruption in their communities. "It's like they're following the same playbook," one caller from Arizona explained. "Our HOA president uses the exact same tactics Sandra did: selective enforcement, social isolation, mysterious property damage. The similarities were too striking to ignore. Working with the FBI's white-collar crime division, we launched a nationwide investigation that uncovered a disturbing pattern. Former associates of Sandra's had established similar operations in communities across 12 states. Local news coverage of our case inspired homeowners to examine their own HOA finances. In California, residents discovered their board had embezzled over $4 million through fraudulent maintenance contracts. In Florida, an HOA president was found selling homes seized through manipulated foreclosures. Each case followed Sandra's methodology, with slight regional variations. Congressional hearings were convened as the scale of the problem became apparent. I testified alongside Oaked residents, presenting evidence that these weren't isolated incidents, but a systematic exploitation of HOA legal structures. These organizations operate with minimal oversight despite controlling assets worth billions, I explained to the committee. They wield quasi-governmental powers without governmental accountability. The hearings led to the Neighborhood Protection Act, establishing federal oversight of HOA finances and operations. The legislation created clear pathways for residents to challenge abusive practices without fear of retaliation. Sandra's case became required study at the FBI Academy as a textbook example of how organized crime adapts to exploit legitimate structures. Crime syndicates had moved beyond traditional territories into the perfectly legal framework of community governance. Most meaningful were the letters I received from homeowners who found the courage to challenge corrupt boards after hearing our story. A group in Seattle successfully removed their entire board after documenting similar abuses. A retirement community in Florida recovered nearly $300,000 in misappropriated funds. Each letter represented not just financial recovery, but reclaimed dignity. People who'd been made to feel powerless in their own homes, finding strength in solidarity and legal action. The legislative analyst who tracked the impact of our case put it best. What happened in OKD wasn't just about one corrupt HOA. It exposed how vulnerable our communities are to organized exploitation. But it also showed that when neighbors stand together, even the most entrenched corruption can be defeated. The greatest vindication came when former HOA victims nationwide began running for local office, transforming governance from the ground up with transparency and genuine community service. Sometimes justice arrives in unexpected ways. Sandra wanted to make an example of me. Instead, she became the cautionary tale. Standing up to tyranny, whether in courtrooms or cul-de-sacs, is always worth the fight, especially when you have the perfect evidence to extinguish their flames for good.